On the cobblestone streets of Cartagena, under the scorching sun of 1843, a black woman walked with her head held high, carrying documents that would change everything. They were not her freedom papers. They were something far more impactful, the purchase contract for her former mistress. The same woman who had branded her with a hot iron now belonged to her. This is the true story of how fate can take such impossible turns that they seem written by the hand of divine justice. The year was 1823. María Clemencia arrived at the Villanueva family's grand house when she was just 8 years old. She had been bought at the port's slave market, torn from her mother's arms, whom she would never see again. The price: 40 gold pesos, less than a purebred horse. Doña Catalina de Villanueva was known throughout Cartagena not for her beauty or refinement, but for the meticulous cruelty with which she treated her slaves. She was a 32-year-old woman, the widow of a Spanish merchant who had left her properties and a considerable fortune. With no children of her own, she had turned the suffering of others into her sole way of feeling powerful. María Clemencia quickly learned the rules of that house, waking before dawn, icy water from the well, preparing the mistress's breakfast exactly as she liked it: thick chocolate, egg arepa, fruits peeled into perfect quarters. One mistake meant the whip. 2 mistakes: the stocks in the courtyard under the midday sun. The city of Cartagena was teeming with changes. Independence from Spain had arrived just 2 decades prior, bringing with it promises of freedom that never reached those who needed it most. Laws stated that children of slaves born after 1821 would be free upon reaching 18 years of age. But for those already branded, chained to their masters, freedom was just an empty word floating in the hot Caribbean air. Doña Catalina had a particular custom. Whenever a slave displeased her severely, she was not content with common physical punishment. She would order the iron with her ornate initial S to be brought and heated until it glowed red like hell. The mark remained on the right shoulder, visible, permanent, a reminder of who held the power. María Clemencia received her brand at age 12. Her crime: spilling a drop of coffee on the mistress's favorite silk dress during a gathering with other society ladies. The pain was so intense that she lost consciousness. When she awoke, the smell of burnt flesh still permeated the air, and Doña Catalina looked down at her with a satisfied smile. Years passed like a contained eternity. María Clemencia grew up observing, learning, storing each humiliation in a corner of her mind where resentment transformed into something colder and more calculated: determination. Don Sebastián Montes was Doña Catalina's accountant, a free mulatto man who managed the estate's books. He had been born free because his Spanish father had recognized him, an almost impossible privilege. He visited the grand house every week to review the accounts, and something in the gaze of 16-year-old María Clemencia caught his attention. It wasn't pity he felt. It was recognition. He saw in her the same spark he had possessed, the hunger to be more than what fate had dictated. One afternoon, while waiting in the courtyard, Don Sebastián left his account book open. María Clemencia, who was supposedly illiterate like all slaves, approached. Her eyes scanned the numbers with a speed that surprised him. She not only recognized the symbols, she understood them. A clandestine education then began. In the brief moments when Doña Catalina was out at her social engagements, Don Sebastián taught her numbers first: addition, subtraction, multiplication, the foundations of commerce. Then came letters, scribbled in the courtyard sand and immediately erased. María Clemencia was a voracious student. She memorized everything on the first explanation. In 6 months, she mastered basic operations. In a year, she could read complete contracts and understand every clause. Don Sebastián was astonished, but also concerned. Knowledge in the hands of a slave was a dangerous weapon, both for the one who possessed it and for the one who concealed it. But María Clemencia had a plan that was just beginning to take shape. She observed how Doña Catalina managed her businesses, properties, and investments. The mistress was wealthy, but not financially shrewd. She spent on imported jewelry and dresses, on ostentatious parties that impressed no one. Her properties generated less than they could because her cruelty made the slaves work only minimally to avoid punishment, never with real motivation. In 1839, María Clemencia was 20 years old and had developed something Doña Catalina could never buy: strategic patience. She didn't dream of escaping. She dreamed of something much more ambitious, though she didn't yet know how to achieve it. Yet, the turning point came when Don Sebastian confided something to her in a low voice while they were reviewing warehouse inventories. The manumission law allowed slaves to buy their own freedom if they gathered enough money. The price was negotiable but generally equivalent to the slave's market value. For a young, strong woman like María Clemencia, that meant approximately 200 gold pesos, an impossible fortune, or so it seemed. Fate has peculiar ways of presenting opportunities. For María Clemencia, it arrived in the form of an accounting error that no one else noticed. Doña Catalina had inherited several properties at the port, warehouses she rented to merchants. Don Sebastian handled the collections, but the mistress insisted on personally reviewing the books each month, not out of diligence, but out of distrust. It was one of her many contradictions. She distrusted everyone except her own judgment, which was flawed. In March 1840, one of the tenants paid twice for the same month due to a misunderstanding. Don Sebastian recorded both payments, but during the review with Doña Catalina, she only verified the first entry. The second payment remained recorded in the general ledgers, but not in the mistress's personal book. María Clemencia noticed the error, and at that moment, with the clarity of a revelation, she understood that system loopholes could be more valuable than gold itself. She began to pay obsessive attention to the books when Don Sebastian left them momentarily. She memorized discrepancies, dates when cash payments were made with no detailed receipts, and moments when the accounting became murky due to Doña Catalina's own negligence. What follows defies all logic of the era and proves that intelligence can be more powerful than any chain. Don Sebastian noticed María Clemencia's increasingly keen interest. One night, after Doña Catalina had retired to her chambers, he asked her directly what she was planning. She did not lie. She explained to him with a calm that contrasted with the audacity of her plan. She wanted to buy her freedom not by begging for it, but by earning it with the same tools white people used, money and knowledge. The proposal she made to Don Sebastian was risky but brilliant. She would identify opportunities to improve the profitability of Doña Catalina's properties, small efficiencies that the mistress would never notice. They would negotiate better prices with suppliers, reduce waste, optimize delivery routes. The savings, invisible to Doña Catalina but real in the accounts, could be gradually siphoned off. It wasn't theft in the traditional sense. It was more sophisticated. It was making sure that money lost due to inefficiency stopped being lost. And instead of simply evaporating in the estate's administrative chaos, it was saved. Don Sebastian remained silent for long minutes. Then he nodded, not out of personal greed, but because he recognized something extraordinary when he saw it. If María Clemencia achieved this, she would be the first slave in Cartagena's history to buy her freedom through pure financial cunning, without donations or favors. The next 3 years were marked by a patience that would have broken anyone with less determination. María Clemencia and Don Sebastian executed their plan with surgical precision. They started small. A warehouse at the port was storing goods inefficiently, paying for more space than needed. María Clemencia suggested a reorganization. Don Sebastian implemented it as if it were his own idea, the monthly saving, 3 pesos. An insignificance for Doña Catalina, but the beginning of everything for María Clemencia. They identified a fabric supplier who was overcharging because he knew no one checked comparative prices. They switched suppliers without Doña Catalina noticing, monthly saving, 5 more pesos. Thus, little by little, they built an invisible flow of money. Don Sebastian opened a discreet account in the name of a fictitious merchant. The savings were deposited there. On paper, they appeared to be legitimate maintenance and operating expenses. In reality, they were the methodical accumulation of the price of freedom. Doña Catalina, engrossed in her own excesses, never noticed that her properties were generating more money than she saw. For her, as long as she had enough to maintain her ostentatious lifestyle, the details were irrelevant. María Clemencia lived a double life. By day, the submissive slave who obeyed every order without questioning. By night, in stolen moments, the strategist who studied every aspect of her mistress's business with more dedication than Doña Catalina herself. There were moments of terror. Once, Doña Catalina asked why the maintenance expense for one of the warehouses had increased. Don Sebastian, with admirable calm, explained that new municipal taxes had raised costs. It was a lie, but he presented falsified documents that the mistress barely looked at before approving them with a dismissive gesture. the dismissive. By 1843, María Clemencia was 24 years old and had accumulated 180 pesos. She needed only 20 more pesos to gather the estimated price of her freedom. She was so close she could feel freedom as something tangible, real. But then, something unexpected happened that would change the entire plan. In July 1843, Doña Catalina fell ill. It was nothing serious at first, just a persistent fever she attributed to Cartagena's unbearable heat. But weeks passed, and the fever did not subside. Doctors came and went, prescribing bleedings and tonics that did no good. The illness weakened her more than anyone expected. By August, Doña Catalina could barely get out of bed. Her face, once robust and always flushed with anger or wine, had become gaunt and pale. Her voice, once powerful and full of sharp commands, was now a hoarse whisper. María Clemencia cared for her, not out of affection, but because it was her duty. But as she changed the sweat-soaked sheets and prepared the infusions the doctors ordered, she observed. She watched as the woman who had been her torment for 2 decades faded, vulnerable and frightened. One detail did not go unnoticed. Doña Catalina had no direct heirs. She had distant cousins in Spain who had never visited her, but no close relatives who could immediately claim the inheritance, and without an updated will, her properties would enter a legal limbo that could last months, perhaps years. Don Sebastian came to visit the sick woman and review the state of the finances. In private, he told María Clemencia something she had already calculated. If Doña Catalina died, everything would become complicated. The slaves would likely be sold to pay debts and legal expenses. María Clemencia could end up in the hands of someone even worse, and all the accumulated money would become inaccessible. They had to act fast. Don Sebastian prepared the manumission documents. The price, 200 pesos, the standard market value for a 24-year-old slave. María Clemencia had 180. She lacked 20. On the night of August 15th, Don Sebastian did something that could have cost him everything. He falsified the final receipt. In the books, it appeared that María Clemencia had completed the payment. In reality, the last 20 pesos never existed. It was a calculated risk amidst the administrative chaos that Doña Catalina's illness had created. The next morning, with Doña Catalina barely conscious and weakened, Don Sebastian presented the documents for her signature. He explained in simple, urgent terms that it was an asset release formality that would protect her estate. Doña Catalina, confused by the fever and vaguely trusting that her accountant knew what he was doing, signed. María Clemencia was free. Freedom arrived without celebrations, without tears of joy. María Clemencia left the grand house one Wednesday at sunset with her manumission papers tucked against her chest and a determination that burned stronger than ever. It wasn't over. It had just begun. Over the following weeks, while Doña Catalina slowly recovered from her illness, María Clemencia settled into a small room in the Gethsemane neighborhood. It was tiny and hot, but it was hers. For the first time in her life, she could close a door and be alone without fear of an order or punishment arriving. But she wasted no time passively enjoying her freedom. With Don Sebastian as a silent partner, she began working as a commercial intermediary. She knew the port's businesses better than many merchants because she had studied the operations for years. She connected sellers with buyers, negotiated commissions, and identified opportunities that others overlooked. Her advantage was unique. She was a free black woman in a city where that was rare, but not impossible. White merchants underestimated her. They thought they could deceive her. A fatal error. María Clemencia knew every trick, every price inflation, every hidden clause. She negotiated with a quiet firmness that disconcerted men accustomed to intimidation. In 6 months, she had multiplied her capital. The 180 pesos turned into 300, then 500. She invested in goods she knew would increase in value. She bought cheap when others needed to sell quickly. She sold dear when demand was high. Doña Catalina recovered, but not completely. The illness had left her weakened, and her temperament became even more erratic. She fired Don Sebastian in a fit of baseless paranoia, accusing him of embezzlement without proof. He left without protest, knowing that any defense would only worsen things. The estate began to decline without his competent management. Tenants fell behind on payments, suppliers overcharged, and the remaining slaves worked less because there was no effective supervision. Doña Catalina, who had never truly understood how her businesses worked, watched her fortune erode without comprehending why. In December 1843, something extraordinary reached María Clemencia's ears. Doña Catalina was considering selling some of her properties. Debts were accumulating. Medical expenses had been exorbitant, and she needed immediate liquidity. Among the properties she considered selling was one María Clemencia knew intimately, the port warehouse, which had been the first source of her savings. It was worth approximately 800 pesos on the market, but Doña Catalina, desperate and poorly advised, was willing to accept less for a quick sale. María Clemencia had exactly 650 pesos. She made an offer of 600 in immediate cash payment. For Doña Catalina, who did not recognize her former slave in the businesswoman before her, it was an unexpected blessing. The transaction was completed within a week. María Clemencia now owned a property she had once secretly managed as a slave. The irony was delicious, but it was not enough. The year 1844 arrived with Doña Catalina in a seemingly unstoppable downward spiral. Property sales had not solved her problems because she did not know how to manage what remained. She spent more than she earned, maintained a lifestyle she could no longer afford, and rejected advice from anyone who tried to help her. María Clemencia, on the other hand, prospered. Her warehouse generated steady profits. She had hired free workers, paying them fair wages, and discovered something Doña Catalina would never understand. People worked better when they felt valued. Her reputation as an honest yet firm businesswoman grew. In March, Doña Catalina put the grand house itself up for sale. It was her last valuable property. The asking price was 2,000 pesos, but everyone in Cartagena knew it was overvalued. The house was beautiful but needed extensive repairs that Doña Catalina had ignored for years. Furthermore, it came with the legal burden of 3 slaves she still possessed, 2 elderly individuals and a 14-year-old girl. Potential buyers were scarce. The house was too large for most, too expensive for a property requiring additional investment. Weeks passed without serious offers. María Clemencia observed from a distance. She had calculated that the house was realistically worth 1,500 pesos. She had 900 in cash after reinvesting part of her profits. It wasn't enough, but she had learned that in business, immediate cash was worth more than future promises, especially for someone desperate. What is about to happen is not fiction. It is the moment when history takes such a powerful turn that it redefines what justice means. In April, María Clemencia requested a meeting with the notary handling the sale. She introduced herself as a merchant, expressed her interest in the property, and asked if Doña Catalina would consider a lower offer if the payment was in full cash, without delays or conditions. The notary, a practical man who knew Doña Catalina urgently needed the money, agreed to present the proposal. 900 pesos plus the absorption of a 100 peso debt Doña Catalina owed to a port merchant. Total cash, 1,000 pesos. When Doña Catalina received the offer, her first reaction was to indignantly reject it. 1,000 pesos for a property that had cost 3,000 when her late husband bought it. It was an insult, but her pride clashed with the brutal reality. There were no other offers. Creditors were pressing. She needed money now, not promises of better prices in the future that might never materialize. The notary advised her to accept. He pointed out that 1,000 pesos would allow her to pay her immediate debts and still leave her with funds to settle in a more modest dwelling, perhaps even save if she was prudent. It was either that or face foreclosure. Doña Catalina, with tears of humiliation, signed the sales contract. She never asked for the buyer's name. She didn't care. She just wanted the shame of having to sell her home to end. The deed was registered on April 28, 1844. The new owner of the grand house, including its furniture and the 3 slaves who still resided there, was María Clemencia, Doña Catalina de Villanueva's former slave. The day María Clemencia stepped back into the grand house as its owner, the Cartagena sky was clear, and the sun shone with an intensity that seemed symbolic. She carried the property documents in a leather folder, walking with a straight back, unhurried. Doña Catalina had left the house days earlier, settling in a rented dwelling in a less distinguished neighborhood, but María Clemencia sent for her. She had something important to discuss regarding the terms of the transaction, the messenger explained. When Doña Catalina arrived at what had been her home, she found María Clemencia sitting in the same living room where she used to receive visitors. She recognized her immediately. The shock was so profound that she had to lean on the doorframe. María Clemencia wasted no time on unnecessary explanations. In a calm, almost gentle voice, she presented the facts. She was now the owner of the property. The 3 slaves Doña Catalina had left were being freed that very day. They would not be sold or transferred. They would be free with papers and the option to stay working in the house for a salary if they wished. Doña Catalina tried to speak, but the words choked in her throat. María Clemencia continued. There was a room for Doña Catalina in the house if she needed it, not as an owner, but as a tenant. The rent would be modest, within what she could afford from the remnants of the sale, or she could leave and never return. The choice was hers. The former mistress collapsed into a chair, her face contorted by disbelief in something deeper, the devastating understanding of what had just transpired. It wasn't just that she had lost everything, it was that she had lost it to the only person she would have never imagined capable of such a thing. María Clemencia approached, knelt before her to meet her eyes, and said something Doña Catalina would carry to her grave. "You taught me that power is the only thing that matters in this world. You were right, but you forgot to teach me that power changes hands when you least expect it." She stood up, walked to the window, and gazed at the city stretching toward the sea. Then, without turning, she added, "You may stay if you agree to live under my roof, as I lived under yours, or you may leave and never return. But if you stay, you will follow my rules, and my first rule is this: no one living in this house will ever again be the property of another." Doña Catalina never responded. She rose with difficulty. She left the house without looking back and never returned. She would spend her final years in increasingly smaller rented rooms, supported by the charity of acquaintances who had feared her when she held power and now tolerated her with pity. María Clemencia remained by the window long after her former mistress had left, gazing at the horizon where the Caribbean met the sky. She felt neither triumph nor joy. She felt something more complex, the weight of having proven that justice, though slow and circuitous, could manifest in ways no one anticipated. María Clemencia lived in the Grand House until her death in 1871 at the age of 52. But the 27 years she spent as the owner of that house were not merely an extension of her life. They were the deliberate construction of a legacy that would challenge established narratives about power, race, and justice in 19th century Colombia. The first months after taking possession of the property were of silent but profound transformation. María Clemencia did not seek revenge in the traditional sense of the word. She did not humiliate the 3 slaves she inherited with the house. She did not brand them with hot irons or subject them to the punishments she herself had suffered. Instead, she gathered them in the same living room where Doña Catalina used to issue orders and presented them with manumission documents for each of them. She explained in a firm yet warm voice that they were free from that moment and could choose to stay working for a fair wage or leave to build their lives wherever they wished. All 3 chose to stay, not out of fear or lack of options, but because they recognized in María Clemencia something they had never seen in an owner: a profound understanding of what the absence of freedom meant. She knew exactly what words, what gestures, what conditions could make a person feel human or reduced to merchandise, and she used that knowledge not to dominate but to uplift. The transformation of the Grand House into a refuge for free people seeking work and stability was not accidental. It was part of a broader vision that María Clemencia had begun to develop during her years as a slave, observing the inefficiencies and cruelties of the system that oppressed her. She understood something few in her era did: that true prosperity did not come from extracting maximum labor with minimum human cost, but from creating conditions where people could flourish and, in doing so, generate shared wealth. In 1845, just 1 year after buying the Grand House, María Clemencia opened a small sewing workshop in one of the rooms that had previously served for Doña Catalina's social gatherings. She hired free women, many of them former slaves who had bought their freedom or received it through their masters' wills. She paid them salaries above the market average and taught them not only to sew, but also to manage money, negotiate prices, and understand contracts. She was replicating, with her own modifications, the clandestine education Don Sebastian had given her years earlier. The workshop prospered in ways that surprised even Cartagena's most established merchants. The women worked with a dedication that could not be bought with threats or whips. They produced garments of superior quality because they had a real incentive. Part of the profits was distributed among them according to the quantity and quality of their work. It was a radical system for the time, a glimpse of what decades later would be called a cooperative economy. Over the following years, María Clemencia expanded her commercial operations with the same astuteness she had used to accumulate the money for her freedom. She bought a warehouse at the port in 1847, a small agricultural property on the outskirts of Cartagena in 1850, and participated as a silent investor in various commercial ventures that needed capital but did not want the visibility of having a black woman as a public partner. She accepted these terms not out of submission, but pragmatism. She knew that some battles were won slowly, by accumulating real economic power, while others fought for symbolic recognition. What made her way of doing business unique was how she balanced profitability with social responsibility. When the cholera epidemic struck Cartagena in 1849, María Clemencia temporarily converted part of the Grand House into a care center for the sick who lacked resources to pay doctors. She did not do it as ostentatious charity or seeking public recognition. She did it because she remembered with absolute clarity what it was like to be vulnerable and have no one offer help. Her relationship with Cartagena's community of free black people was complex. Some admired her as an example of what was possible to achieve with intelligence and determination. Others viewed her with suspicion, considering her too close to white people, too involved in the commercial system that had sustained slavery. María Clemencia never tried to resolve these tensions with explanations or justifications. She simply continued doing what she believed was right, creating real economic opportunities, not empty promises of future equality. The definitive abolition of slavery in Colombia came in 1851, just 7 years after María Clemencia bought the Grand House. It was a moment of mass celebration in black communities, but María Clemencia observed the festivities with a mix of joy and calculated skepticism. She knew from personal experience that legal documents did not automatically eliminate the structures of power and inequality that had been built over centuries. Legal freedom was the first step, not the last, and she was right. The years following abolition showed that many former slaves received their freedom without resources, land, education, or the social connections necessary to prosper in an economy still dominated by the same white families who had owned slaves. Some ended up working in conditions barely better than slavery, trapped by debts and abusive contracts. María Clemencia responded to this reality by expanding her operations in a way that specifically benefited recently freed people. She created a microcredit system before that term existed, lending small amounts of money to people who wanted to start their own businesses but had no access to formal banks that only lent to established proprietors. The interest she charged was fair, the terms were clear, and more importantly, she offered advice on how to manage the borrowed money. Not all projects prospered, but those that did generated a multiplier effect in the community. In 1856, María Clemencia was 37 years old and had accumulated a fortune that rivaled that of many traditional white families in Cartagena. But unlike them, she never used her wealth to buy social status or to integrate into elite circles that would have rejected her anyway. Her power was economic and, therefore, more solid than social power, which depended on perceptions and traditions. There were attempts to discredit her, rumors about how she had obtained her initial money, insinuations that she had stolen from Doña Catalina, baseless accusations that she maintained inappropriate relationships with white merchants in exchange for favors. María Clemencia ignored all of this with an indifference that disarmed her detractors. She did not need to defend her reputation because her actions spoke louder than any slander. What few knew was that María Clemencia maintained regular correspondence with Don Sebastián Montes, who, after being fired by Doña Catalina, had established his own accounting firm in Bogotá. In their letters, they exchanged not only information about business and commercial opportunities, but also reflections on the state of the country, on the real possibilities of equality in a society just emerging from slavery, and on the limits and potentials of economic freedom as a tool for social transformation. Don Sebastián visited Cartagena in 1862 and stayed in the Grand House for 2 weeks. It was the first time they had met again since the turbulent days of 1843. They walked together through the same corridors where years before they had secretly conspired to accumulate the price of freedom. And Don Sebastián confessed something María Clemencia had already intuited, that by helping her, he had been healing his own wounds. He had been born free by accident of birth, not by merit, and had always felt a diffuse guilt for the privileges it afforded him, while others, equally capable, remained chained. Helping María Clemencia had been his way of doing something significant with that accidental privilege. María Clemencia's final years were marked by consolidation rather than expansion. She gradually began transferring the management of her businesses to the people she had trained for years, creating a structure where ownership and control were distributed among several managers instead of being concentrated in one person. It was her way of ensuring that what she had built would survive beyond her own life. In 1869, at age 50, María Clemencia began to experience health problems that doctors of the era could not precisely diagnose. It was likely some form of heart or kidney disease, conditions for which there was no effective treatment at the time. Over the next 2 years, her physical vigor gradually declined, though her mind remained sharp until the end. She spent her final months putting her affairs in order with the same meticulousness she had applied to every aspect of her life. Her will was an extraordinarily detailed document that distributed her property among the people who had worked with her, with specific clauses to ensure that none of her properties would be sold to families who had owned slaves. It was a legally questionable clause, but well enough drafted to survive initial challenges. María Clemencia died on March 3, 1871, surrounded not by the blood family she never recovered, but by the family she had chosen and built, the women of the sewing workshop, the managers of her businesses, the people who had found in her not a patron, but a mentor and ally. Her funeral was an extraordinary event for Cartagena. Hundreds of free black people attended, recognizing her as a symbol of what was possible. But white merchants who had done business with her and learned to respect her astuteness and her word also attended. The procession that carried her body to the cemetery deliberately passed in front of what had been the house where Doña Catalina lived her last years in poverty and isolation. It was not cruelty, but a silent reminder of how fate had rewritten 2 lives that began at opposite ends of the social hierarchy. Doña Catalina had died 19 years earlier, in 1852, in conditions of relative poverty. Her death went virtually unnoticed, recorded in the parish archives with the impersonal brevity of someone who no longer mattered to anyone. She left no significant inheritance, no legacy worth mentioning. Her name survived only in legal documents and in the memories of those who recalled her cruelty as a warning about the dangers of power without empathy. The contrast between these 2 deaths, between these 2 legacies, says more about justice and meaning than any philosophical treatise. María Clemencia, born with nothing, branded with a hot iron, the property of another for 16 years, left an impact that extended decades beyond her death. Doña Catalina, born to privilege, possessor of property and power, vanished from collective memory as if she had never existed. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and justice. Was what María Clemencia executed revenge? In the traditional sense, no. She never sought to inflict the same suffering she had experienced, but in a deeper, more complex sense, perhaps it was. The revenge of demonstrating that the social order Doña Catalina considered immutable was actually fragile and contingent. The revenge of proving that intelligence and determination could overcome the advantages of birth. The revenge of living well and building meaning in a world that had tried to reduce her to merchandise. What makes this story particularly relevant is not only the extraordinary facts it describes, but what it reveals about systems of oppression and the possibilities of resistance. María Clemencia did not wait for others to grant her freedom out of compassion or legal changes. She built it herself, step by step, with a patience that required almost superhuman psychological strength. She lived for years with the contradiction of being legally enslaved while developing the skills and accumulating the resources that would eventually free her. Her story also reminds us that individual liberation, though important, is not enough. María Clemencia could have simply used her freedom to secure her own comfort and security. Instead, she chose to create structures that facilitated the liberation and prosperity of others. She intuitively understood what decades later would be articulated as theory: that true freedom is collective, that no one is truly free while others remain oppressed. In the archives of Cartagena, among yellowed documents fragile with time, there still exist the records certifying the transfer of ownership of the Grand House to María Clemencia. There are the deeds to her other properties, the accounting ledgers showing the profitability of her businesses, the wills that distributed her wealth. They are silent but irrefutable testimonies that in 1843, in a city where slavery was still legal and structural racism defined every aspect of social life, a woman achieved the impossible. But beyond legal documents and commercial records, María Clemencia's true legacy lives in the question her life poses to each generation. What will we do with the injustices we observe? Will we passively wait for oppressive systems to collapse under their own weight? Or will we actively build the alternatives we wish to see? Will we use the power we accumulate to replicate existing hierarchies or to create new possibilities? María Clemencia chose to build. She chose to transform her suffering into wisdom, her oppression into strategy, and her personal liberation into collective opportunity. She was not perfect. She did not solve all the problems of her era. She did not eliminate racism or inequality in Colombia. But within the space she could influence, within the lives she could touch, she demonstrated that a different world was possible. This is the revenge no one expected. Not the destruction of the oppressor, but the construction of alternatives so robust that oppression itself seemed obsolete. Not the dramatic spectacle of immediate justice, but the slow, meticulous, and cumulative work of creating dignity where before there was only humiliation. Not the proclamation of theoretical equality, but the practical demonstration of capability that no prejudice could deny. María Clemencia's story reminds us that the most transformative moments are not always the most visible. It was not the signing of her manumission that was the most important moment of her life, though it was legally significant. It was every day she spent secretly studying numbers, every strategic decision on how to accumulate and protect resources, every moment she chose calculated patience over immediate gratification. Real transformation happens in invisible spaces, in small decisions that, accumulated, create monumental changes. And so, in a house in Cartagena that was once a stage for cruelty and oppression, María Clemencia wrote with her life a definitive answer to the question of whether justice is possible in an unjust world. The answer is yes, but not in the way we expect. It does not come from above as a proclamation from benevolent authorities. It comes from below, built by people who refuse to accept that the circumstances of their birth define them. It arrives slowly, painfully, requiring sacrifices that should not be necessary, but it arrives. This is the final lesson María Clemencia leaves us, that true power is not in the ability to control others, but in the ability to control our own destiny. That true victory is not in defeating our oppressors on their own terms, but in creating entirely new terms where oppression no longer makes sense. That true freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of possibility. In 1843, under the scorching sun of Cartagena, an impossible story became real, and in doing so, it expanded the limits of what all future generations could consider possible. That is the legacy no tomb can contain, no document can fully capture, and no future injustice can erase. And yet, there is something more that must be said about this story, something that transcends documented facts and enters the territory of what it means to remember, of what it means to preserve memory in a world that constantly tries to erase uncomfortable truths. When María Clemencia died in 1871, she left specific and detailed instructions in her will about what should be done with the grand house. The property could not be sold to any family that had owned slaves at any point in its history, a revolutionary clause that her legal heirs tried to contest, considering it excessively restrictive and practically impossible to verify. The legal disputes lasted almost 5 years, consuming resources and generating heated debates in Cartagena's legal circles. Eventually, under pressure from creditors and due to the complexity of maintaining the restriction, the property was divided and sold in parts. But for as long as the clause remained in effect, it forced every lawyer, notary, and potential buyer in Cartagena to meticulously review historical slave ownership records. It was a forced confrontation with a past that many would have preferred to forget. An exhumation of family sins that the elites considered buried forever. The descendants of the women who worked in María Clemencia's sewing workshop continued operations for 2 more generations until the late 19th century, when industrialization fundamentally changed the nature of textile trade in Colombia. But the cooperative structure she had established, where workers shared profits proportionally to their labor and actively participated in decisions about production and prices, left a profound mark on how some Afro-descendant communities in Cartagena organized their economic activities for decades afterward. It was not just a business model, it was a philosophy of life. That shared prosperity was more sustainable and fairer than individual exploitation. There exists an extraordinarily fascinating detail in Cartagena's municipal archives that is rarely mentioned in official histories, probably because it challenges comfortable narratives about progress and oblivion. In 1875, exactly 4 years after María Clemencia's death, a group of 12 Afro-descendant women, all former workers from her various businesses or daughters of those workers, presented a formal petition to the municipal council, They requested permission to establish a textile and food trade cooperative with a shared ownership structure and democratic management. In the extraordinarily well-drafted and argued document, they explicitly cited the model María Clemencia had created as a historical precedent and legal justification. They argued that if a woman had been able to successfully establish such a structure for decades, there was no legal or moral reason to deny them the same right. The petition was rejected for technical reasons that barely concealed the true motive: the fear of white commercial elites that a precedent of independent economic organization among Afro-descendant communities would be established. The official reasons cited irregularities in the incorporation documents and concerns about the applicant's ability to manage tax obligations, but the minutes of the municipal council preserved in the archives reveal comments from council members who clearly expressed their discomfort with the idea of black women operating businesses without the supervision of white patrons. The rejection was a tactical defeat, but the very existence of the petition, the fact that these women knew María Clemencia's story in enough detail to use it as a legal argument, and that they had the audacity to present themselves before authorities who considered them inferior, demonstrates that María Clemencia's legacy did not die with her. It lived in the imagination and determination of those who remembered her. The story I have reconstructed is extraordinary for its facts, but perhaps even more importantly, for the difficult questions it poses to each generation that discovers it. Why do names like María Clemencia not appear in textbooks when we study Colombian history? Why do school narratives celebrate merchants and politicians whose fortunes were built on slavery, but ignore those who resisted and overcame that very slavery? The answer is as uncomfortable as it is necessary. Because official historical narratives have been written predominantly by and for the descendants of those who held institutional power, not by those who challenged it from the margins. This selectivity is not accidentally neutral. It is a form of epistemological violence, a deliberate attempt to control which stories are deemed worthy of telling, which lives are considered worthy of remembering. When we remove stories like María Clemencia's from collective memory, we not only commit a historical injustice against her specifically, we commit an injustice against all future generations who need to know that people in impossible circumstances have found ways to transform their realities. We limit the horizon of what is possible. We reduce the spectrum of resistance and transformation models available to those who today face their own oppressions. Preserving and disseminating stories like this is not merely an act of historical justice, though it certainly is. It is fundamentally an act of political imagination and pragmatic hope. When young Afro-descendants in Colombia, in Latin America, anywhere in the world, learned that in 1843, under conditions that seemed designed to make any form of liberation impossible, a woman achieved what María Clemencia achieved, it radically expands their sense of what they can consider possible in their own lives. The stories we tell ourselves about the past are not passive entertainment. They are maps, tools, fuel for the imagination of different futures. María Clemencia never wrote memoirs, never kept an intimate diary, never recorded a first-person testimony of her lived experience. This absence is painfully common in the histories of enslaved and marginalized people. Their voices reach us filtered, fragmented, mediated, reconstructed from records created by others for entirely different purposes: legal documents of sale, notarial records of transactions, property inventories where human beings are listed among furniture and animals. Every fragment of information about María Clemencia had to be excavated from archives that were never designed to honor her humanity, but to document her status as merchandise and later as an anomalous owner. And yet, even in these arid and bureaucratic fragments, even in the cold language of contracts and deeds, the strength of her will, the clarity of her strategic vision, the superhuman persistence of her determination shine with an intensity that no document can fully contain, nor any silence erase. The numbers in the accounting ledgers tell a story of methodical accumulation. The dates on the property documents tell a story of impossible ascent. The clauses in her will tell a story of a vision that extended beyond her own life. Every bureaucratic record is inadvertently a monument to her genius. This is the story we need to carry forward, not as a historical curiosity, not as an exceptional anecdote that confirms the general rule of oppression, but as systematic evidence that structures of domination, however solid and permanent they may seem, always contain cracks, contradictions, spaces for maneuver. And that extraordinary individuals, armed with intelligence, patience, and unwavering determination, have repeatedly found ways to identify these cracks and widen them into paths toward freedom. María Clemencia's story is both a testament to the past and an urgent invitation to the present, to look at our own circumstances with critical eyes, identify the cracks in the structures that limit and oppress us, and have the monumental courage to systematically widen them. In the bustling streets of Cartagena today, among tourists photographing colonial architecture and vendors offering souvenirs, very few know the name of María Clemencia. There are no statues in public squares, no commemorative plaques on buildings, no streets named after her, no official monuments honoring her memory. The Colombian state, so prolific in erecting statues to generals and politicians, never considered that a woman who went from slave to owner through pure astuteness deserved public recognition. This absence of official recognition is itself a political statement about which lives are considered worthy of commemoration. But in the archives, in the yellowed and fragile documents that survived over a century and a half of Caribbean humidity and institutional negligence, her name remains indelible. María Clemencia, owner, merchant, liberator, visionary. And in that archival persistence lies a powerful promise that true stories, no matter how much contemporary elites and later generations try to hide, ignore, or minimize them, find unexpected ways to survive, to resurface at crucial moments, to remind us who we truly are as societies and what we are truly capable of achieving when we collectively refuse to accept the limits others try to impose on us. This is the ultimate revenge that absolutely no one expected or could anticipate. Not the violent destruction of the oppressor, not the exemplary punishment of the guilty, not the public humiliation of the one who humiliated, but something far more enduring and transformative. The unbreakable persistence of memory against organized oblivion. The insistence of real history against sanitized official narratives. The absolute refusal, generation after generation, to be forgotten, silenced, or reduced to a footnote. María Clemencia won her freedom by buying it with intelligence and patience. She bought her dignity with strategy and hard work. She built her legacy with vision and generosity toward those who came after. And in doing all this under conditions designed to make every step impossible, she demonstrated something that resonates through the centuries, that true victory is not measured by the temporary defeat of an enemy, but by the creation of alternatives so solid, so real, so materially existing, and so well documented that the world has no choice but to eventually recognize them, even when that recognition comes centuries later, when all protagonists are dust, but their actions remain as an indestructible testimony of human possibility.